All right, econ friends, welcome back to another topic. In this one, in topic 6, we're going to be talking about this broad idea, really important idea, that's called market failure. Market failures represent effectively difficult cases for the market. Market failure also opens the door to discussions about the role of government within an economy in terms of the government being a mechanism or an actor, a player that can help mitigate market failure. Okay, so let's jump into it now with a quick overview, and then we'll discuss the specific instances and we'll map them out graphically. Okay, so by way of context, up until now in our discussions, we have learned that markets, specifically competitive markets, okay, markets in open competitive environments, that due to the incentives that they generate, due to the incentives that drive consumers and the incentives that drive businesses to act in their own rational self-interest, we have learned that markets are ultimately very efficient mechanisms. And they are efficient mechanisms for handling one of our key economic tasks, which is the allocation of scarce resources. So again, up till now, we've built up a base of knowledge and we've demonstrated that markets, okay, due to this idea of rational self-interest, that markets are efficient mechanisms for allocating scarce resources. We've shown in our discussion that typically markets will generally maximize efficiency. And we know now that markets, specifically competitive markets, will generally maximize total surplus, which is a measure of the economic well-being of society. We also demonstrated recently that government interference in competitive markets, specifically through the form of either a price floor or a price ceiling, that these interventions can distort markets and can generate, as we learned, deadweight losses. So we built up a pretty solid foundation to believe that competitive markets, through the self-interested behaviors of buyers and sellers, is going to be a tool to allocate scarce resources efficiently, to maximize total surplus, to generate the biggest number of win-win exchanges and overall benefit society. However, if you're going to make smart economic decisions, you have to know the big story. You have to know cost and benefit. And the reality is that there are cases where freely functioning markets fail to lead to socially desirable outcomes. And that, my friends, is a market failure. So specifically, by way of definition, market failure is any circumstance in which a free, unregulated market fails to maximize economic efficiency. Remember, our big goal, the big economizing question when you have a world of scarce resources, is to allocate those resources efficiently and generate the most gains for society. A market failure is a circumstance in which free, unregulated markets fail to maximize that economic efficiency. When a market failure occurs, the market equilibrium price and the market equilibrium quantity, in other words, the P and the Q that emerge from supply and demand, they do not align with what we would call the socially efficient or the socially desirable price and quantity. In other words, when you have a market failure, there's going to be a discrepancy between what the market itself generates and what society believes should happen. In a market failure, this generally manifests itself with the free market either producing too much or too little of a particular item. And again, that's a market failure because we believe, we hope, that competitive free markets will lead to the right amount of an item, and that the price is a signal to generate that right amount. So when there's a market failure, that signal gets distorted, and the free market, if left alone, either produces too much or too little of an item. Now, market failures inherently get political, even though they're economic phenomena, because any discussion of market failure is going to lead to several normative questions arising. Whenever you're talking about market failure, we're going to have normative questions arise. Specifically, questions like, number one, if the market is not producing the socially desirable amount, what is the socially desirable amount? And question number two, if a market is failing to produce this, how should we remedy that? Should it be done through private citizens and private negotiations? Should it be done through the government? What role does the government have? So we're going to have a lot of interesting discussions within this around the role of government, around normative questions of what society wants, and about the pros and cons, the costs and benefits of interfering in a competitive market. Okay? By way of category, there are 4 general broad categories of market failure. The first one is known as an externality. An externality is a side effect of a transaction that affects somebody who is not directly involved. An externality, in other words, occurs when there's a market transaction and the transaction of the people in that market somehow spill over and affect an external, outside, third party who was not directly involved in the transaction. Seen a different way, we can say that when an externality exists, the actions of the market participants, and again, market participants are the suppliers and the buyers, the suppliers and the demanders. When you have an externality, the actions of these participants create external costs or external benefits that harm or benefit another person. A second category of market failure is a public good. A public good is defined as an item that you can consume without paying for it and without diminishing the amount that is left over for somebody else to consume. It sounds kind of tricky and wordy, but at the end of it, what it means is that with a public good, which is an important and beneficial product, there's no incentive for the private market to create it. So we have externalities, we have public goods. A third market failure is a lack of competition. A lack of competition can lead to inefficient production and higher prices for consumers. And if you think back, all of our discussions up to now, where we've said that the free market can be an efficient tool to allocate resources, we've assumed that we're talking about competitive markets with strong property rights and easy entry and exit for competition. So competition's been assumed. When you have a lack of competition, we're typically going to find inefficient levels of output as well as higher prices for consumers. And the fourth and final type of market failure is a lack of information, or if you want to use the fancy jargon term, what we call asymmetric or uneven information. A lack of information, aka asymmetric information, occurs anytime that one party to a transaction, say either the buyer or the seller, has significantly better information than the other party. Our assumptions up to now have been that both buyers and sellers, the supply and demand parts of a market, that they've both had fairly equal and critically adequate information to make smart decisions, and that their self-interest has been guided in part by that adequate information. Whenever you have a situation where you have asymmetric information, incomplete information, a lack of information, You're going to get a situation where prices will either be too high or too low, and therefore the allocation of the good in question will be flawed. And in some extreme cases, you might even see a lack of information totally cripple a market. So again, my friends, to recap, we've been saying up to now that markets, free competitive markets, do a fairly good job of allocating scarce resources and maximizing social efficiency, maximizing overall economic welfare. However, there are situations that occur in which the market fails to do that. Those four situations are externalities, public goods, lack of competition, and a lack of information. In our subsequent lectures in this topic, we'll break each of these down one by one. We'll go through some definitions, and where appropriate, we'll also map out graphically how these failures look, and then we'll talk about some ways to possibly fix them. Thanks, and I'll see you in a bit.